In recent years, I've come across two pieces of popular wisdom which seem to me to be entirely contradictory of each other. According to the first, it's absolutely crucial to improve ourselves in every way, and it is taught that this is absolutely possible. This is something we can do, whether it's by changing our diet or meditating or even taking more exercise. In fact, the other day I was strongly encouraged to buy a gadget which would record the number of footsteps I took in a day. And I think I was supposed to aim for 10,000 or something like that. But against this, there's another piece of popular wisdom, which is that actually nothing that we do makes very much difference. We have no control over our actions. We are determined by prior events, so we're not in fact free at all, whether that's some sort of genetic determinism or the idea that our neural processes mean that the decisions we apparently take are not in fact free at all, but are predetermined by some prior event. I rather suspect that this latter view is a piece of bad philosophy masquerading as good science, and I'm much more attracted to the former approach, which is that we can in fact, by disciplining ourselves, make a substantial difference to our lives. And in the light of that, I want to now look at the temptation story in Luke's Gospel. Now, first of all, the word temptation is, of course, one that has all sorts of resonances today. It's changed, I suspect, from its original force to something that was latterly to do with a sort of naughty sexual temptation, or most recently even the temptation to eat more than is good for us when we're tempted to eat a piece of chocolate or a piece of cake or something like that. And this, of course, is trivializing the whole idea of temptation as it's seen in Luke's Gospel, and indeed as it was originally meant to refer to a time of very testing trial. That being said, temptations to sexual behaviour which are untruthful and uncharitable can be very damaging, and even the misuse of food and resources as a result of greed and the desire to acquire more and more can be equally destructive of others and indeed of the environment itself. So when we come on to the temptation story in Luke, there are all sorts of interesting things that arise. First of all, what really happened. Now, the fasting that is depicted is quite extreme, 40 days and 40 nights. Whether this is meant to be taken literally or not is unclear, but it was clearly a very testing time, a very long time without food and possibly without a drink as well. And in such circumstances, there have been plenty of studies which have indicated that in that sort of situation, an altered state of consciousness can be achieved, in which the experience of flying and the experience of fighting against some sort of inner or outer force of evil is something that may well happen. And so if one wants to look at what really happened, however this was experienced by Jesus and however it was recorded, this is in fact quite a plausible human experience. And when we look at what Jesus is actually being tempted to do, these particular temptations, firstly to turn stones to bread, to use violent force to bring about his agenda. The devil shows him all the kingdoms of the world and says, these can be yours if you will worship me. And finally, the temptation to engage in a dramatic self-display of power that will bring people to Jesus' cause. All these temptations can be subsumed under a few very basic headings. What sort of diabolical attack is Jesus under, for a start? Well, here you can either see the force of evil as something external, some sort of diabolical spiritual being perhaps, or rather more as internal demons, things that you are fighting against within yourself. And insofar as Jesus' humanity was a genuine one, he will have been tested in this way. If you choose to regard the assault as having come from outside, from some sort of devil figure, that is fine too, as long as you don't use that as an excuse to regard evil as a purely external force, something that is found in other countries, in other parts of our own country, even in the House of Commons, whereas in fact we should be looking for it within our own personalities, within our own hearts. And if these different types of temptation can be brought under a few headings, let's see what the result is. First of all, I think that the turning of the stones to bread is all about some sort of use of power for self-gratification. This is the desire to affirm yourself by giving into greed, by giving into desire to give yourself something that you feel you need. The second temptation, the one where Jesus is on a high mountain and sees all the kingdoms of the earth and is tempted to worship the devil and so receive them, I think is looking at a shortcut, an abuse of power to bring Jesus to the ends that he is looking for, to use violence, to use purely political means, conventional means, to bring about his kingship. And finally, a further abuse of power, the use of his charismatic qualities to draw people to himself, the idea of being on the temple and throwing himself down and testing the angels to bear him up, lest he strikes his foot against a stone, as the devil says, quoting scripture, as of course the devil always does. But I think behind all this, there is something very basic. First of all, the devil is saying, if you are the Son of God, you ought to be able to do these things. In other words, the devil is tempting Jesus to doubt himself. And in tempting Jesus to test God, as Jesus responds angrily, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test, the devil is tempting him to lose his trust in the good purposes of God, instead to opt for a shortcut to his own power, to his own glory, and not to have the patience to wait for God's good purposes to work out. For if Jesus' trust in God is complete, he will not take these shortcuts, firstly to self-gratification, secondly to an abuse of political power, and thirdly to a misuse of his charismatic qualities. And Jesus overcomes these temptations. He dismisses the devil, and the devil is depicted as departing, to return at an opportune moment. And I think this indicates that the demons against which Jesus was struggling were not to be defeated by one supreme act. They were going to return, and he was going to have to constantly battle against them. Most noticeably, and I think Luke is intending us to think of the devil returning at the point of greatest trial when Jesus is facing his own death. And what difference is all this going to make to our own lives? Well, we can try to follow Jesus' example in battling against the temptations to self-gratification where it's inappropriate, to the abuse of power, and to the misuse of our own charms and gifts that God has given us, to give us power over others, to give us shortcuts to what we want, what we are trying to achieve, and denying us the chance to wait patiently for God's purposes to be worked out. Can we simply follow Jesus and it will all be easy? Well, I think here, even though at the beginning I opted for the self-improvement model of human identity rather than the genetic determinism, I think it is certainly true that we are a lot less free than we think, that we are hedged around with all sorts of genetic inheritances, of environmental factors that make us who we are and make it supremely difficult for us to behave in virtuous and loving ways from time to time. To that extent, we are much less free than we think. And I suspect that this may be a scientifically credited truth that lies behind the doctrine of original sin, the idea that however hard we try, we cannot achieve perfection in this life. But in case that is a counsel of depression and despair, let us consider that Jesus, in his humanity, leaving aside any claims to divine status, has traditionally been seen as the first human of a new creation, free from sin, free from the determinism of the past, whose freedom enabled him to prevail fully against his temptations and to embark on the way of the cross in trust that God would vindicate him. And insofar as he is the first representative of a new kind of humanity, he calls us to follow him to overcome, in the strength of his empowering love, all that blights our lives and prevents us from living fully as authentic humans, trusting fully in God, not putting God to the test, and not misusing the powers we have been given for inappropriate ends.